Sir.
Very good afternoon, all the chairpersons and the speakers of this session. It's a privilege to moderate this session on a very important topic in trauma. So in trauma, the most common cause of shock is hemorrhage. The next most common cause of shock is hemorrhage, and so forth. And this ongoing bleeding in a trauma patient results in a trauma triad of death, which includes coagulopathy, hypothermia, and metabolic acidosis. But thing is not that bad. This process is reversible, provided you diagnose traumatic shock early and start resuscitation, which includes the most important management, that is stop the bleeding, and stop the bleeding. And there are many ways to stop the bleeding in trauma patients. And to discuss these procedures, hemostatic procedures, I invite the chairpersons, I request the chairpersons to start the proceedings of this session. Thank you very much. Many ways to stop the bleeding in trauma patients. मेरे के बीच में कर रहे हैं.
Should I introduce the next speaker, sir?
I request Dr. Anita Dhar ma'am to introduce the next speaker. Let Dr. Asuri should introduce the next speaker. Sorry.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. As usually the discussion goes, we always do a head-to-toe examination. I think the best way to start will be to how to deal with maxillofacial bleeding. For this, I'd like to invite Dr. Ruchi Pathak, who is presently pursuing her PhD course in Jayaprakash Narayan Apex Trauma Center. She has done her MBBS, and it will be a privilege to listen to her what she's going to talk about maxillofacial bleeding. Over to Dr. Ruchi Pathak, please. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation, sir. I would like to share my screen. So now today we are on the third day of our Trauma Virtual 2020, and it has been a plethora of sessions, and there have been amazing sessions. As the stage has been said by Dr. Subodh regarding the 3 coagulopathy cycles, now regarding the cycle, and so now I will take it forward, speaking on maxillofacial bleeding. The agenda for this will be an overview of maxillofacial bleeding, algorithm for emergency management of maxillofacial bleeding, arterial supply of the nasal septum and lateral nasal wall, and a step-by-step process of placing a posterior nasal pack. Now, maxillofacial region, as we said, starts from the head, so is very prone to because of its rich blood supply, and the life-threatening maxillofacial hemorrhage can vary from 1.4 to 11%. And so 1 in every 10 fractures bleeds significantly. Major vessels involved in maxillofacial trauma are internal and external carotid arteries. If we look into the algorithm for the emergency management, the purpose of hemostasis here is basically two-way. The first one is protect the airway. So according to the ATLS protocol, the A stands for this airway which we need to protect. And therefore, the first step is to identify the source of bleeding and then clear the airway with the process of suctioning. And the second step is to reduce the blood loss. Now, to reduce the blood loss, now we know that we need to identify the source of bleeding. In case of a maxillofacial injury, it is usually three-way. It is either an extraoral source, an intraoral source, or nasal. In case of extraoral source, it could be a face or scalp. We can apply sutures or additional pressure to stop bleeding, but if it doesn't, then we go for angioembolization. Now coming to the next, which is intraoral, it could be either bony or soft tissue. If it is bony, because of fractures, we need to reduce these fractures, which usually stops the bleeding. If it does not, then we need to definitely go for angioembolization. In case of soft tissue, we need to apply sutures and then pressure, which again stops the bleeding usually. If it does not, then definitely we need to go for angioembolization. Now, today I'm going to discuss more on the nasal aspect. The nasal bleeding is on the anterior end and on the posterior end. On the anterior side, we can go for pressure packing. But what is the cause of the anterior bleeding? So most of the time, it is the Kesselbeck area or the Little's area, which is a plexus which is formed by multiple arteries. And this area, if happens to rupture, causes severe bleeding, which can be controlled by pressure packing. If it does not, then we can go for an anterior nasal pack or balloon tamponade. Similarly, with the posterior region, we cannot pack this region. So now here we need to go for a posterior pack, and it becomes very important to know exactly how to place this posterior pack. I will take you through a journey where I will first take you through the arterial supply of nose so as to know the kind of epistaxis and the ways we can control it. Let's get on to the whiteboard. And as we see, that the blood supply of the nose can be divided into septum and lateral wall. If you look at the septum, the basic supply of the entire nasal cavity is either external carotid artery or internal carotid artery. If you look at the internal carotid artery has ophthalmic artery as its branch, which is further divided into anterior ethmoidal and posterior ethmoidal branches. Please see here, in the anterior portion, we only have anterior ethmoidal artery. The posterior ethmoidal artery is not there in the anterior region, therefore does not form the Little's area or the Kesselbeck plexus. This is very important. Next, we have the external carotid artery with its 3 branches. The superior labial, dividing into septal branches to provide the Kesselbeck's area. The maxillary artery is divided into greater palatine and sphenopalatine. All the 4 arteries which join at the anterior region form the Little area, and this is 85% of the times the area which bleeds and causes anterior epistaxis. Now, if you look into the lateral area of the nose, the difference, the anatomical difference only lies in the fact that in the lateral nasal wall, we have the maxillary artery dividing into lesser palatine, greater palatine, and sphenopalatine. So that is the only difference. Otherwise, the anatomical region remains the same. Now, the posterior region bleeds because of 2 main arteries. The first one being the ophthalmic artery, the branch, posterior ethmoidal branch, and the second one being sphenopalatine artery. And therefore, if we have to go for angioembolization, these are the 2 areas we need to look into. Now, after this bit of an anatomy of the nose, let us get into the next, which is a demonstration of posterior nasal packing on a 3D printed model. So there are certain steps to take care of. The first step is suction and clear the passage. As I said, we need to have a clear airway before we start anything. So by suctioning and clearing that area, we need to clear the air. Second step is checking the Foley's catheter and marking. So before we even insert the Foley's catheter, we need to check it. So we take a 12 or a 14 French Foley's catheter, insert 5 ml of saline and check that there is no leakage in the balloon out there. Once we check that, there are 2 steps that we do here. We not only check that there is leakage, but we also calibrate the length that has to go inside the nostril. Now, how do we do that? According to the literature, it has to be 8 centimeters. So what we do is we can place our finger. That is what I do. We place our finger, and the length of my finger is approximately 6 centimeters. I take another 2 centimeters. That goes to 8 centimeters. I can mark it on the catheter. And if I don't want to mark it, I can just hold it there. And then after this, we come to the next, but before we place it, we need to remove the saline that we had poured in. And now we can take this and insert the catheter along the floor of the bleeding nostril after we lubricate it with the jelly, with the lignocaine jelly. And but make sure that marking is clear. So just recheck that again if you haven't marked it, and then insert it inside. So 8 centimeters is a very safe length that we can take for this insertion into the nasal cavity. And once it is there, we can then insert 5 initially to begin with 6 ml of saline to actually block the posterior area so that the balloon can inflate initially and engage in that area. Once we've done that initial amount, which is 6 ml, we can apply a little traction over the catheter. Once you apply that traction, it actually engages well in the posterior region. Once you feel that you can actually feel it has engaged, you can then actually insert another 1.5 ml, which can increase up until 15 ml. So that is the maximum limit, but one should not go beyond 15 ml, and it can be less than 15 ml depending on the distress which is being experienced by the patient. Usually 15 ml is an amount which is sufficient to actually block the arteries and block the epistaxis. And then we place the gauze below the LR region, and then we need to clamp this, we need to clamp the catheter out there. After this, let us get a little bit behind the scenes of the nasal pack. What happens is that length between the anterior nasal spine and the posterior nasal spine, in my case, was 5 centimeters. But generally, taking into consideration the soft tissue, we take it as 8 millimeters. And this was a study which was done by McGarry in 1991, where he said that 8 centimeter is the safe distance. Now, secondly, as you can see here, where the balloon engages initially. Now, if you know that the balloon engages here, now this 6 ml is initial amount which is taken. And the reason to that is with 6 ml, the engagement is very precise. With less than 5 ml, it is said in another study by Lee that this actually comes out. So therefore, the first insertion is amount of saline is 6 ml. And after this, as we can see, how much inflation is much. So as I explained, it is 6 ml initially according to the study. But as we go ahead, 1.5 ml we can insert sequentially till it is 15 ml. We have to check before we insert after 6 ml, after a little bit of time. So after a while, we have to check it again if the posterior nasal bleed has stopped or not. Now we can just watch a little video on the posterior nasal pack, which is a live video. This was done in our emergency department. So as you can see here, this is the Foley's catheter, which has been taken, being inserted into the nasal cavity. And after you've been inserted the amount that you need, this is the initial 6 ml that you insert so that it can engage in the nasopharynx. And once you do that, you can then create that traction to actually engage it. And then when you move it forward, and then you can clamp. Similar situation, if you need to pack the other nostril and it hasn't been done, you can repeat the same scenario on the other nostril. And once you place it, you can then tie both of them together, engage it on the gauze. And that's how we go for posterior nasal packing. These are the references. Thank you very much for the patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Ruchi. That was an excellent talk, and it was refreshing to see the whiteboard being used. I'd now like to invite the other chairpersons to kindly introduce the next speaker. I think so we'll be taking the question and answers at the end of the session. Can we have the next chairperson introduce the next speaker, please?
Yeah, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can hear you, ma'am.
Hello. Yeah. May I invite Dr. Abhinav Kumar? Hello. May I invite Dr. Abhinav Kumar for the next talk? Dr. Abhinav Kumar, he is Assistant Professor in the Division of Trauma Surgery and Critical Care at JPN Trauma Center, AIIMS, New Delhi. Dr. Abhinav Kumar, kindly start the talk.
Yeah, good afternoon. Am I audible now?
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am, for your kind introduction. And I just, at the beginning, I just give my greetings from my institute and thankful to the organizer to giving me an opportunity to talk on this. So at the outset, I would like to say that then trauma management is a management where it's a common platform, meaning either you are a trauma surgeon or a trauma physician or a trauma nurse. Your motto is the same. And what sir has said, Dr. Subodh, that first and foremost is the stop the bleeding. Stop the bleeding. That's the hemorrhage control. And that's the topic of which I'm going to discuss and how an ICD becomes an hemostatic intervention. And the second motto is the continuum of care. And that it is of prime importance importance, and it must not be, and it must be maintained at any cost during your treatment, right? Start from the resuscitation till your rehabilitation of the patients. So as a trauma physician, nurse, you must be passionate about it, and it matters. Coming to this, the ICD as a residents, when we were surgical residents, it was taken as one of the common invasive procedure which were being taught, and it still holds the true now in acute trauma setting, that it's a life-saving tube when it is indicated. And you must remember when it is indicated is so important. And as we have gone through the lectures yesterday, which was on thoracic injuries, where in majority of patients with thoracic trauma, if you just a simple intervention, that is the ICD insertion, and what we call in a trauma management phase, there is a non-invasive management or non-invasive intervention, it becomes a definitive management in majority of the traumatic patients with hemothorax, pneumothorax, or hemopneumothorax. So the question comes to your mind, how a tube, which we have learned as a resident, is it's a drainage tube only, is it? So to understand this, let us understand how it works, what is its function. The basic physiology of a pleural cavity is that it has a negative intrapleural pressure, and this is what a negative is so important here. It keeps the lung inflated, and that is how, if the lung is inflated, it creates a good ventilation perfusion. So whenever there is a trauma, what will happen? There will be either accumulation of air, maybe lump parenchymal injury, or there will be a fluid. What is that in trauma? Fluid is blood. So where it comes from, the blood. In chest, the main cause is the intercostal vessels. The second is the bleeding from the lung parenchyma, and the third from the major vessels. So, when there is this negative pressure is attenuated, and the vicious cycles also, and the physiology gets deranged. But as a matter of concern, whenever you talk of stop the bleeding campaign, where you talk of compression. So here, if you just put a tube, what it does, it allows the lungs. First of all, it takes you to the normal hemostasis physiology. That is it maintains the negative intrapleural pressure. And what is it doing? This ICD insertion, what it does, it expands the lungs, and you will understand why expansion it helps. See, it expands the health, and it opposes the pleural cavity, and it gives the compressions to the intercostal vessels. When you talk of the bleeding from the parenchyma, it is a low pressure system. So when it expands, it acts as a tamponade, and the bleeding stops. And for the major vessels, the answer is surgery. You have to use your knife. So this tube, what we have said, that is it acts as a one-way valve, which only allows the passage of air or fluid. It doesn't need the other way service. So this is what it makes you understand that it becomes not only a drainage tube, but a hemostatic tube intervention in acute trauma setting. What are the factors which are concerned in trauma? In trauma, which have been very particular, everybody talks about right person in a right time and a right place. So here, if you have to understand, we'll be understanding in the three measures what is the timing when we should put it, the place where we are trying to put this tube, the person who is going to put, and the procedure how we are going to demonstrate in the video so that it becomes safe for the patient. So timing in trauma everywhere, the timing is critical. If you are on time, adequate timing, the outcome will changes. So it is critical. So as a trauma physician, when you are in a resuscitation bay, it is the interventions where you have to judge clinically patient on the basis of the physiological parameters, what is called the clinical parameters, which is the essence of the primary survey, where you have to just look on the primary measures, and then you have to assess and intervene. The adjuncts, what you call the radiology, it's an adjunct. One should understand it is just a supplementary an essential. So whenever you are in doubt, that you should not wait for the radiology to come, because it's very difficult at a level 1 center where we just talk of point of care where the radiology comes to the patients, either be X-ray, ultrasound. Here, your interventions should not wait for the radiology. So you must be on the basis of your clinical and physiological, you must intervene. And whenever, and keep it in mind, whenever you are in doubt, put a tube. So where should we be putting a tube? It's better that you put in a controlled environment. And the best control environment is the hospital. But it depends on if you go and take out the global scenario where the patient depends on the trauma system of the country where you are having, you can put it into the pre-hospital setting also has been said. But it is, as the bottom line is, you have to put in a control environment, and best control environment is your resuscitation bay in the hospital. Who should be there? And the answer is this: the procedure any trained person can put. Don't make it a bottleneck that a trauma surgeon should only be putting. Any person involved in the trauma care in the resuscitation bay should be trained and be competent enough to put a tube. And the motto should be that the patient safety is to be ensured, keeping in mind, do not harm, do no further harm to the patients. And literature has said, if you're not adequately trained and experienced enough, the complication rates are operator dependent. So training is a must. And next, we'll tell you how we are going to this one. Though simple, it is critical. At the outset, whenever you are dealing with trauma patients, all patients are this is a medical legal case. So whenever you are doing any intervention in a patient, the informed written consent is a must. It should not be, except in cases of extremes where you don't require. But other than, you have to take consent. For this video presentation, which I'm going to demonstrate, a prior consent of the patient was taken for the video demonstrations. I'm thankful for the patient which has given the consent for it. And before giving, a single shot of antibiotic is indicated prophylactically, and it depends on most of the institution, but single shot of antibiotic is preferred. Indicated. So, so to begin with, it is said that you should be prepared. Any trauma system, you should be prepared for yourself. So preparation begun is called half done. So preparation starts with the what you are there with the armamentarium. We should have a tray ready at in the resuscitation bay. That includes the artery forceps, scalpel, blade, suture material, needle holder, the local anesthetist, and the ball with the sponge gauges, and the 2 ICD tubes. And preferably you take around 28 French of the ICD and the ICD bottle. So just a word of caution here, the ICD bottle here. So, एक minute. The ICD bottle, एक minute, here, what you have to take, you have to just before when you're going for a procedure, just there is a marking here that you must fill the bottle with with the adequate marker, which forms the column movement for the ICD to be there. So you have to place the fluid there and be prepared for it. And in trauma setting, it is said that this ideal situation we have a very armamentarium of student, but in limited resources, you also can do, and what you can do have is the artery forceps, scalpel blade, your forceps, needle holder, and a blade with the 2 tubes, and that also can suffice. So when you begin with it, is come to the marking. What we talk about the triangle of that every day, and here what we are talking about the triangle of safety. And this is how it is marked. It is the anteriorly, it is the lateral border of the pectoralis major. Posteriorly, it is the latissimus dorsi, and the line which is vertically drawn from the nipple area, that it forms the base of the triangle. And how to just go to about spaces. One method is you corner the mid-clavicular line and count down the reps when the first space is the second first and come down and you go laterally. This is how we have to go about it. And in female patients, what is the best is we go around the inframammary fold so that it becomes, and you are anterior to the this mid-axillary line, this anterior mid-axillary line. The positioning is so important here. You have to just keep the arm abducted as shown in this. They keep the arm abducted and place it behind the head so that it is stable. Doesn't hamper when you are just you're in a process of putting a tube. So next step is when you take it, then the proper aseptic technique is to be used to drape yourself with your gowns, use betadine, and surgically, as just like an eagle's eye, you must expose your area, what your concern is, so that the triangle of safety is your visualized. And before and when you are doing this, maintain the asepsis, means at no point of time, because this may get infected also. So again, when you are draped it, again reconfirm the positions. However, where is your angle of safety, triangle of safety? Why it is so important? The triangle of safety is fifth intercostal base, because here the muscle bulk is less. One. Second, it is said that the diaphragm may come up, so you are less likely to injure any diaphragm. So this procedure is painful. So local infiltration with 2% xylocaine is recommended, and you just have to infiltrate. And the doses is you have to calculate as per the less than 3 ml per kg body weight. So infiltrate the area, and you go till the periosteum, also infiltrate the pleura. And you should wait when you have just created an area fan-shaped. You should wait the local anesthesia to act upon before you are putting your scalpel. So this is a must, because it takes time to act, and this is studies have shown that this is painful. If it has said that they may VAS score, may go into 9 to 10. The incision is given at the pre-marked site, and its incision should be targeted at according to the size of the tube which you are using. Generally, it is 28. I said in the beginning. So at 1 centimeter of is sufficient enough, and you start dissecting. And here I tell you, there are 2 ways you can dissect it. In the video, we are demonstrating how we are dissecting with the help of a finger, what you call the finger thoracostomy. Here you should be targeting just above the lower border, superior border of the lower rib. Why it is so? Because the upper border, because the neurovascular bundles are at the lower edge of the upper bundle. So you have to protect that one. So you enter with the finger that becomes safe, and you should not be in a haste. And alternatively, you can use your curved hemostats for this purpose. But finger thoracostomy, if you are well enough, then it is that. And as soon as you enter the pleural cavity, there will be a sudden give way. And what next you have to do with the finger, just 1 minute, with the finger, rotate all around yourself so that any adhesions and all this are broken up. So you don't have, and you get the idea what you have there inside the line. And it is very safe. Either you put with then mount the tube with the in the artery forceps and insert it in it. And when you are inserted, as shown here, when you are inserting the tube, the direction should be the apex, that is the superior, posterior, superior. And when you are entering, it should be to and fro motion. Why it is said so? Because it helps you to know whether the tube is kinked or not, and whether you are progressing in it. If the tube is kinked, you will not be progressed. So this is quite handy when you are entering into the pleural cavity and placing the tube posteriorly. So when you have placed the tube posteriorly, the second step comes out to be secure the tube. And this is how we take a good suture with the silk and with this tie it so that it becomes an air seal type of things. So there is no air leak coming from entering into from the outside to the. And to ensure the effective seal, take a sponge and cut in between, just like you make a pan, and go across the side, both sides of the tube, place it and effectively and place the sponges and seal it. And this sealing is to be effective so that no air enters. And this is how we are just dressing tubes, and must see the tubes as what you have shown in this, so that there is a play and maintains an effective seal. At the end, when you have done with it, it is connected to the water seal bottle, which is just below this, and you look for the presence of air column in there. Is there an air column in the air column swing is there, and this this completes the procedure. This completes the procedure, but this is not the complete. As we said, the continuum is to maintain, and you should quickly reevaluate. Is a must. Get an X-ray to just have a post-procedure placement of the tube, document the procedure, and must document in your file the ICD care. So summarize, it's a life-saving procedure when indicated, done in during the primary survey. It's an hemostatic, and what you say is tube in time saves life. And whenever you are in doubt, put a tube in a safe method. Thank you. Thank you for the patient hearing.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Abhinav, for demonstrating so beautifully the most important step which can save patient's life. Very aptly demonstrated through the video, and I'm sure everybody must have benefited through this video. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I pass on the mic. Please stop sharing the presentation. Thank you. I request Dr. Hemanga to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, the organizing team, to giving us the opportunity to share this auspicious session. Now, I welcome Dr. Narendra Chaudhary. He is an assistant professor in Department of Surgery, JPNA Trauma Center. He will speak about perihepatic packing as a hemostatic maneuver. With this, I welcome Dr. Narendra Chaudhary, please.
Thank you, sir, and good afternoon all. I welcome you all on board. Without wasting much time, I start my presentation. So next couple of minutes, I will take you through the salient features and minor details of perihepatic packing, which is a component of damage control surgery. So keeping in mind the limited time, I will not touch damage control surgery as a component, and I will directly go through the perihepatic packing. And I will also touch the points of controversies. What are the points of controversies in perihepatic packing and the finer details of the packing? So damage control surgery is initially coined terms by the Stone and colleagues regarding the truncated laparotomy. Later on, Rotondo and colleagues coined the term DCS as a three-phase techniques in 1993, and they reported that by abbreviating this laparotomy, the survival rate is drastically increased. They initially introduced it as a three-phase, but later on, Johnson and Schwab has refined it to the 4 phases. This original term was originated from the US Navy warship, and their primary motto is, when the damage occurred to a very high extent to a ship, their primary purpose is to keep the ship floating. So the same analogy will be applied to the damaged person, where his life should be, the patient should be keep alive by doing minimum things, whatever we can do to ensure the normal physiology. Basic purpose is to avoid the lethal triad. I will not go in detail. So I will directly jump to the principles of trauma laparotomy. Trauma laparotomy are slightly different from the laparotomy for the peritonitis or elective procedures. Open communication with fellow anesthetist and nurse is essential. The motto is never work in isolation. Always communicate your concerns with the anesthetist team, what the anticipated injuries you are anticipating in the patient, nature of injuries you are anticipating, and inform the anesthetist when entering the abdomen, because sometimes the sudden decompression of the abdomen, release of the hemoperitoneum may lead to collapse of the hemodynamics of the patient. So anesthetist should be warranted in front that we are decompressing the abdomen so that he can do the needful in the timely manner. Sometimes anesthetist also requires giving the inotrope support to maintain the hemodynamics. In such a conditions, we can give the manual compression over the aorta, or we can do the cross clamping of the aorta and buy time for the anesthetist to infuse the blood so that they can maintain the hemodynamics of the patient. Our primary purpose of the damage control surgery is to maintain the hemodynamics, is to maintain the normal physiology as long as possible by intervening minimally to the patients. And the two aim is the main: control the bleed, control the contamination. So our top priority is the control of the hemorrhage and contamination control. Then the next controversial question is arise during the management of the hemorrhage of the patient. Should we remove the damaged organ or should we repair the damaged organ? Again, this totally depends on the hemodynamics of the patient and the nature of injury that particular organ sustained. Say, for example, spleen is there, spleen is having grade 4, grade 5 injury, actively bleeding, and patient's hemodynamic are crashing, then we left with the option of removing spleen rather than repairing that, because repair may take longer time, and that longer time has indirect effect of stress on the patients, and the lethal triad can set in, or the patient is already in the lethal triads and we are worsening by prolonging the surgical procedure. So our basic purpose is to truncate the laparotomy, truncate the procedure bare minimum, so that we can restore the hemodynamics by arresting the hemorrhage. As Dr. Subodh rightly said, control the bleed, arrest the bleed. Next is damage control. Packing doesn't stop bleeding, doesn't terminate the operations. Re-explore the patient, never send the patient without control of the hemorrhage in the primary operation, in the view or in the optimism that this bleeding will stop by itself during the resuscitation in the ICU. No, if you are having the soakage of the perihepatic packing or any other packing, please don't shift the patient out of the OT. Again, repack, again, explore. There may be the surgical bleed that can be tackled with the surgery. So always re-explore whenever you find that there is recurrent shocking of the PACU. The abdomen should always be left open using temporary closure techniques, because there are chances that because of the massive transfusion, patient develop abdominal compartment syndrome. So, and sometimes we need to again go back or re-explore the patient. To minimize the time of the re-exploration, we always keep the abdomen open and close it with Bogota bag or some other commercially available devices. So come to the position and the incision. The patient should be in the supine position with both the arms at the right angle. He should be panted and draped from chin to the pubic symphysis or mid-thigh, because you never know, sometimes you have to convert the laparotomy into thoracotomy to control the bleed or to have the aortic cross clamping. So always pant the patient from chin to the mid-thighs. Always give a midline incision and expose the midline, and just try to enter the midline from about 2 to 3 centimeters above the umbilicus, where the largest sheath is there. And once you cut the sheath, there will be the preperitoneal fat popping out. Just swipe it again and divide the peritoneum, and just with your finger you can enter inside the peritoneal cavity. So midline incision will lead to sometimes very limited exposure that may not be sufficient to cleanly see or cleanly observe the liver surfaces. So sometimes you have to extend the midline incision by adding one more subcostal incision toward the right side, about 2 to 3 inches below the costal margin, to improve the visibility of the damaged organ, as well as to improve the liver packing. So without wasting time, I will come to the video of the liver packing. Please be with me. It's taking time to open the video. So I will go through the video along with the procedure. So now the patient is panted, draped, and the midline incision has already been given. Are you able to see my video?
Dr. Narendra, we cannot see your video. I think you can open it separately.
You'll have to share the screen again, I think.
Okay, I will again share the video, no problem. So we will give the midline incision with the panting and draping has been done from chin to the middle of the thigh.
Have you optimized the video sharing? On the left, when you share on the screen, on the left, there's a prompt to optimize the video settings.
Yes, sir.
Just check it and then start the video.
I think you'll have to run the video, and on that video screen, you'll have to share the screen. Then you'll be
Definitely.
able to see the video.
So midline incision has been given. Patient is panted, draped from the chin to the middle of the thigh. We just entered above the umbilicus. And now the incision is extended. We are in the midline, and you will see a gush of the blood in the trauma laparotomy that is coming out. 2 wide bore sections are there to control the bleed. We are just eviscerated the small bowel so that we can see. This is the technique of packing. We will two-fold the laparotomy sponge, 1 fold, and then the 2nd fold. For effective packing, these should be saline soap. Now we will do the 4-quadrant packing. 1 pack over the liver, 1 pack over the spleen, 1 pack over the each of the paracolic gutter, and 2 packs in the pelvis. But sometimes, because depending on the habitus of the patient, the pack may be required more. Rather than 6, may require 8 or 9 packs depending on the habitus. So this is the pelvic packing. Look, once the packing has been started, we are very helpful to have the arrest of the bleed. So we are compressing the bleed, and after that we will remove the pack 1 by 1 from each quadrant to see the bleed from the specific organ. So packing has been done. Meanwhile, as I demonstrated, the communication with the anesthetist is always required during the opening or decompression. We have just seen the hemodynamics of the patient and had a communication with the anesthetist whether they are all right or we require some operative maneuvers to control the hemodynamic collapse. Now is the time for the hepatic packing. So here the controversy is that whether we should divide the falciform ligament during the hepatic packing or not. So the literature has a conflicting evidences. The most convincing one is that if the laceration or liver damage is on the anterior surface or superior surface, we can go ahead with the intact falciform ligament because it will helpful in the proper tamponade formation over the liver. So here we are doing perihepatic packing with the falciform ligament intact. We placed 2 packs on the each side of the falciform ligament over the anterior superior surface of the liver to have the local tamponade effect over the damaged area in order to arrest the bleed. So this is packed. Then 2 packs will be over the inferior surface of the liver for a proper tamponade effect. Meanwhile, you have to also inspect the anterior and the inferior surface of the liver, whether there is any laceration or direct laceration that can be tackled with the direct pressure or not. Here you can see the inferior surface having the laceration. So we have just placed a hemostatic sponge over there and applied direct pressure so that it can be controlled in a direct way. Sometimes even after all these measures, the bleeding is not stopped. Even after doing the Pringles maneuver, the bleeding is continuously going on. And in that case, the suspected bleeding may be from the IVC or from the posterior surface of the liver. In view of the proper visualization of the posterior surface, we have to divide the falciform ligament. So in that case, we have to divide the falciform ligament. Here it is the falciform ligament. The bleeding is suspected from the posterior surface or higher superior surface of the liver. So 2 hemostats are applied over the falciform ligament. And falciform ligament is divided in between up to the coronary ligament, and coronary ligament is also taken down. Now you can see the exposure of the superior surface is also very better, and you can see the superior surface up to the very highest point. And we can put the superior surface, we can pack the superior surface inferiorly and posteriorly so that the tamponade effect can be placed. Now you can appreciate that much higher number of packs are required after dividing the falciform ligament for producing that same tamponade effect. I'm cutting short now. It's packing has been done. Complete hemostasis has been achieved. There is no soakage of the packing pads. Now the patient is ready for temporary laparoscopy and to be shifted to ICU for further resuscitation, and to bring him back after 48 hours to 72 hours, depending on the hemodynamics of the patients. Now the time is to temporarily close the abdomen with the Bogota's bag or the indigenously prepared Euro bag cutting along with mesh, polypropylene mesh in the form of mesh laparoscopy. Here it is packed, and now it's the mesh laparoscopy. So with this, I end my session here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my video on this platform.
Thank you, Narendra. It was a nice presentation. Also a very good video considering the fact that this is an emergency situation. Now I invite Dr. Akshay Kumar to welcome the next speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to invite the next speaker, Dr. Dinesh Bagaria, who's an assistant professor in the Division of Trauma, Surgery and Critical Care at the JPNX Apex Trauma Center at AIIMS, New Delhi. And Dr. Dinesh is going to talk about pre-peritoneal pelvic packing, another very important aspect in hemostasis control in the emergency department in the trauma center. Thank you. So Dr. Dinesh, over to you.
Thank you, respected chairperson. I think the screen is visible and I'm audible clearly. Hello.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, you are on.
Respected chairpersons, dear delegates. So let me take you from one important aspect of damage control for the pelvic hemorrhage. Traumatic, this is pre-peritoneal pelvic packing, rather unconventional and I would say uncomfortable part for a general surgeon. Most of the time, general surgeon don't come to see and do this kind of thing. So as we know, hemorrhage is the second most common killer in injured patient. And if we talk about the preventable injuries, 36% of the hemorrhage death post-blunt trauma are preventable, and one of the most significant contributor among them is the pelvic hemorrhage. The mortality is quite high, 40 to 60% among the patients who are presenting with the shock, and up to the 90%. In fact, if it is more than thoracic acute aortic dissection patients who are presenting in the extremis. If you see the footprints around the pelvic bone, we can see that these hard pelvic bone, they are surrounded by many tiny, small and medium-sized blood vessels. So you can assume what kind of force needed to crack these pelvic bone, and that force, what it is going to do these poor vessels. So the most common injury we came across are road traffic crashes and fall from significant height, with leading to pelvic fracture. And the pelvic fracture, as I said, the force needed is quite significant. Again, will lead to significant injuries to the intra-abdominal, intrathoracic, and even head injuries, along with in few unfortunate patients bleeding into the pelvis, which most of the time in 85% patients is the venous in nature, and in 15% patients, it is arterial in nature. So we have to do the management accordingly. The initial management is irrespective of mechanism, irrespective of status. It is the physiology correction. So we need to follow the ATLS protocol. If patient is bleeding significantly, we need to start massive transfusion protocol. And presently the tranexamic acid is an indispensable part. Now, as far as the pelvic management per se is concerned, there are three lines of defenses we use. The first line of defense is mechanical stabilization using pelvic compression devices or C-clamp or external fixator. Now, what is to be used is depend upon the sources availability and individual institute preference. We used pelvic compression devices, and in fact even the literature also, it is shown that there is no significant difference in the stability when we are using external fixator vis-a-vis pelvic compression devices. The second line of defense and the crux of this talk is pelvic packing. So this we do for 85% of the patients who are bleeding because of venous bleed. So the venous bleed is one which we take care of which we take care by using pelvic packing. Approach, there are two approaches. One is total extraperitoneal approach. Second is intraperitoneal approach. Which to use, we will discuss later. First, let's have a look on the video. So this is total extraperitoneal approach. We do a midline skin incision, suprapubic. Some people also use Fenton steel incision. You give the skin incision, divide the subcutaneous tissue, and now you are on the rectus muscle. You separate the rectus muscle in midline, and you are entering into the preperitoneal space of the radius. If there is pelvic injury, this space already has been created by the pelvic hematoma for you. Just suck out the blood and then insert 2 or 3 lap pad on either side of the bladder. Now, one thing which we need to take care of is that most of the time the bleeding is from the posterior part of the pelvic bone and sacrum, and we have to approach that space anteriorly. So we have to push our lap pad along the curvature of the pelvis bone so that they lie as posteriorly as possible on either side of the pelvis. We don't want our lap pad to lie just behind, anterior pelvis, behind the pubic crust, pubic symphysis, or pubic rami. So we have to push them posteriorly as much as possible along the curvature of the pelvic bone. So this is the total extraperitoneal approach. Now, if our patient is having fast positive and we don't know whether it is bleeding intraperitoneal also, we use intraperitoneal approach. And for that, first we have to do laparotomy. We have ruled out the intraperitoneal source. After that, we will separate this retroperitoneum from the pubic bone anteriorly. Again, if there is hematoma, this work has already been done. You just need to shear the pelvis off, this retroperitoneum of the pelvis, and then on either side of bladder, put 2 or 3 pack on either side of the bladder, depend upon the space. Again, push the bladder hard along the curvature of the pelvis so that the final lie of the packing is posteriorly as much as possible. Like you can see this imaging taken after packing, and you can see that mass of the pelvic packs are lying posteriorly along the curvature of the pelvic bones. So which to use, again, as I told you, if your patient is reasonably stable, you has ruled out other intra-abdominal injury, you can use total extraperitoneal approach. Otherwise, if there is expected source of bleeding intraperitoneal also, we use intraperitoneal approach. Most of our patients, we use intraperitoneal approach only. Post-packing management, patient need to be shifted in the ICU, continue with the resuscitation. Ideal time to revisit OT is 48 hours if your patient is getting stabilized. If patient is not getting stabilized, you have to revisit before that, remove that pack and assess. If there is need, you have to repack again. Otherwise, at 48 hours, you have to remove the pack, because keeping the pack longer than that, there are high risk of infection. Now, the third line of defense is to manage in 15% of patients where there is arterial bleeding. So we have option of Reboa, we have option of angioembolization, and the other option which we generally use is the bilateral ligation of internal artery. Reboa is more or less a resuscitation measure rather than a definite measure. Internal intervention radiology, again, is a time-consuming process, resource-constraining process, which as of now in most of the center in India we don't have. So we propose the procedure which we can use is the bilateral ligation of internal iliac arteries. Again, the approach are two: intraperitoneal approach and extraperitoneal approach. For the sake of limiting time, I am not going to play the intraperitoneal approach video. So what we use extraperitoneal approach, sometimes I will show you that. Sorry. So once you have do the packing in the pelvis, again you just shear this retroperitoneum from the lateral most edge of your laparostomach, and you shear it medially. Once you shear it medially, you will come across these vessels, external iliac vessels and internal iliac vessels. So here you need to take care of ureter, identify the ureter and push it medially so that you don't injure it. And then you take hook of the internal iliac vessel and ligate it. We recently revisited our experience of last 5 to 6 years, and we recently presented it also at the ACS Clinical Congress. So my take-home message that we need to promote more PCCT application in the pre-hospital and inter-hospital transfer, because that is more important part. Pelvic hemorrhage management is the responsibility of trauma and general surgeon. We need to take care of it, and we have to learn ourselves, and we have to teach our students that how to take care of pelvic hemorrhage management, and whatsoever available options as per our resources, all are then complementary rather than competitive. Thank you very much for the organizers giving me opportunity and patiently listening to the delegates. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Dinesh. That was a wonderful talk on pre-peritoneal pelvic packing. May I now ask Dr. Asturi Krishna to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Akshay. Now we come to a very important topic. Actually, this is a topic which is indispensable to the management of hemorrhage in trauma. And there's no better person than Dr. Shivananda Gaunagwati to talk about this. He's a professor in Department of Radiology at All India Institute of Medical Sciences. And he has done a lot of work in saving patients' life from hemorrhage using interventional radiology. Now I request Dr. Shivananda sir to kindly proceed with this talk. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Krishna. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizing team. So, can you see my slides, Krishna?
Yes, it is.
We can.
Yes, sir. It is seen, sir. We can see, sir. We can see.
Yes.
So I will be showing some video presentation of the cases where the IR plays an important role in the control of bleeding in trauma setting. So main role of IR in trauma, we broadly divide them into therapeutic and the prophylactic. So amongst the therapeutic, where the IR plays an important role is the embolization of a vascular injury in the form of active extravasation or a pseudoaneurysm or AV fistula. That is the main bulk of our angioembolization in our trauma center. The other therapeutic role is the control of bleeding in especially anatomically stringent sites like pelvic fractures and the maxillofacial injuries. Third one is the rebleeding following any kind of packing, where be it is a perihepatic, nasal, or a pelvic packing. So that constitute a major bulk of our IR treatment in the trauma setting. The other setting is the prophylactic, where there is a high grade liver or splenic injuries. So in order to enhance the success of the non-operative management, we do prophylactic embolization mainly in the liver and the splenic. Before I show the angioembolization videos, important is we go close to the site of a vascular injury in order to prevent the non-target embolization. If at all we are not able to reach the site of bleed, then we reduce the perfusion pressure by putting a embolizing agent like either gel foam or a coil. And time is a money. So if at all you want to ask the help of the IR person, do it upfront. Don't wait for a coagulopathy or a metabolic acidosis to set in. If once a coagulopathy sets in, whatever we do, it's not going to help. So the first case is the hepatic injury case. So this is a case where the patient has a high grade the hepatic injury associated with the vascular injury in the form of pseudoaneurysm. If you see here, there's the contrast blob, not well appreciated in the arterial phase, but I will show it in the venous phase. If you see here, there is a large intraparenchymal hematoma with associated with gross hemoperitoneum. And as I scroll it down, we can see here there is a well-defined contrast blob, suggestive of a pseudoaneurysm. So this is an ideal situation where the IR plays an important role. So we took this patient for angioembolization. This is a celiac axis angiogram. We are not able to appreciate the actual site of the pseudoaneurysm. So for that reason, we have to go super selectively into the hepatic artery. So if you see here, there's a contrast blob. Again, we went more selectively, very close to the site of by looking at the angiogram as a road map. So we reached the site. Okay, this is the site of the pseudoaneurysm. Reach the site, and next step is very simple. We just put a coil in the feeding artery. So this is the after the putting a coil. This is the check angiogram that shows the complete obliteration of the pseudoaneurysm and sparing the posterior branch of the right hepatic artery and as well as the left hepatic artery. So this is the posterior division which is spared, and this is the left hepatic artery. Okay, that is the case. Next case is the role of embolization is the active extravasation. So I'm going to show this case. If you see here, there is an active extravasation of the contrast. That suggests there is ongoing bleed. Okay, and there is in addition there are extensive lacerations involving almost all the segments of the right lobe. And this is the area of contrast extravasation, and there is a gross hemokeratosis. So in this case, if you see here, the selective angiogram of the right hepatic artery confirms the finding of CT. There is active extravasation. And we reach the site of the active extravasation, cannulating selectively the feeding artery. So next is we put a coil here into the feeding artery, and the bleeding has stopped. And the final angiogram shows no filling of this or visualization of the active extravasation, sparing the entire adjacent liver parenchyma. So these are the two situations where pseudoaneurysm and the active extravasation that constitute the major bulk. The other role, as I said, after the packing, if you see here, this patient was taken for damage control surgery. Hepatic packing has been done. And this patient continued to bleed even after the packing. So this patient was taken up for, although I don't have a video, I'm just showing a spot images. If you see here, there is an active extravasation as well as a pseudoaneurysm from the posterior sectoral artery, so which was embolized using a coil. So this is another situation. Coming to the anatomically stringent areas like maxillofacial injuries, majority of these patients are managed by nasal packing and putting up Foley's into the posterior nasopharynx and the nasal area. But even after nasal packing, this patient continue to bleed. So in such cases, IR help is taken. So this is case where there is a maxillary artery is showing active extravasation of the contrast. If you see here, into the maxillary sinus. So just we have to put a gel foam or a coil reaching the site. If there are multiple sites of a bleed, then we just put the gel foam. If it is a single vessel, we can go reach the site and put a coil. So in this case, we put a coil because this was a bleeding from the internal maxillary artery. This is another case. If you see here, the significant maxillofacial injury, nasal packing has been done with a Foley's. And if you see here, in this case, there is a bleeding from the anterior ethmoidal branches as well as the intramaxillary branches and the ascending pharyngeal branches. Hello? Disconnected. Hello?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, you are
audible and visible.
Yes.
Can you see the video?
Video नहीं आ रहा.
No.
It's not visible.
Video बंद हो गया है sir.
Wait.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it is
Yes,
visible
we
now.
can.
Okay.
Yeah, visible.
So this is the bleeding from the multiple branches. Okay. So in such cases, what we do, we just put a gel foam into the external carotid artery branches, mainly in the intramaxillary and the ascending pharyngeal, and the hemostasis is achieved. This case, if you see here, there is a active extravasation of the contrast from the intramaxillary artery into the maxillary sinus. So again, we put a coil followed by gel foam, and the hemostasis was achieved. The third case, the third setup is the pelvic fractures. Although our surgeon do pelvic packing and the intra-iliac, there are certain situations where the IR help can be taken if the patient is hemodynamically stable, and we pick up a finding of any active extravasation or a pseudoaneurysm on the CT. So this was a case. Hello.
Yes, sir. Audible and visible.
Audible and visible.
I'm getting some problem in the PowerPoint. Stop. Okay. Just hold on, this PowerPoint is stuck actually now. Okay, can you see the video slide?
Yes, yes.
So
Yes.
this was a case of a pelvic fracture involving the quadrilateral plate. If you see here, there is a bony spike of the fracture fragment. And this case was actively bleeding. Surgeon, the orthopedic surgeon, he was planning for fixation and he started bleeding. Okay. So this patient was immediately shifted. If you see here, there is an active extraction pseudoaneurysm from the obturator artery of the internal iliac division. So this was selectively cannulated and embolized using a coil. So this is a post-embolization. The pseudoaneurysm is blocked and sparing the rest of the branches. The other kind of intervention, this is a pseudoaneurysm from the inferior gluteal artery. So again, this was showing the large pseudoaneurysm arising from the inferior gluteal artery. So we reached selectively that feeding artery and put a coil, and the pseudoaneurysm is blocked. Okay, coming to the peripheral vascular injury, there are the management of IR is mainly plays a role in the hemorrhagic form of peripheral vascular injury. Ischemic, we don't have any role to play. And in this case, there was a AV fistula between the superficial femoral artery and the superficial femoral vein. So in order to, the main intention is to save the superficial femoral artery and block the rent. So these are the angiograms. So that confirms the finding of AV fistula, if you see here. Okay, there's a large AV fistula communication, and we reached distal to the rent of the AV communication. Next is to close the rent by putting a stent graft. So this is a stent graft. So the stent graft has been placed across the AV fistula site, and the artery was saved and the flow was restored and blocking the AV communication. Suppose the bleeding vessel or is from the muscular branches. In this case, this patient also had an aneurysm from the profunda femoris artery, if you see here. So in these cases, we can sacrifice this vessel by putting a coil. So we sacrifice this vessel by putting a coil. So these are the main cases. I will just finish like last video by showing the splenic injury. This is a grade 4 splenic injury with a contrast blob, if you see here, suggestive of an active extraction contrast with a large perisplenic hematoma. So unlike the liver injury where we go selectively reach the site of bleed, in splenic injury, what we do is just we put a coil in the proximal splenic artery just before the splenic hilum. We don't reach the site of active bleed. We just want to reduce the perfusion pressure. So here we put a coil in the proximal splenic artery before the splenic hilum and reduce the perfusion pressure. Rest body will take care of it. So that is the difference between the liver injury management and the splenic injury management. So liver, we go selectively reach the site, whereas splenic, we just put a coil in the proximal segment to reduce the perfusion pressure. Thank you. Hello. Hello.
Thank you very much, sir, for excellent talk. Thank you very much, sir. They were very excellent videos, and I'd like to thank you for all the help that you have been providing to the Division of Trauma Center, along with Dr. Atin. He also needs a mention. You form a very excellent team. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Rajshekhar to invite the next speaker.
Hi, good afternoon. The next speaker is Dr. Krishna Kumar Govindarajan. Dr. Krishna Kumar is an additional professor of pediatric surgery at Chibmar Pondicherry. And it's indeed our pleasure and privilege to have him here. Over to Dr. Krishna Kumar for his presentation. Dr. Krishna Kumar?
Thank you, sir. Hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are audible.
Yes,
We
you
can't
are
see you
audible.
yet.
Yes, sir. Just wait for the screen sharing to.
Yes, sir, we can see you now. Yes, sir, we can see, we cannot see the screen yet.
Yeah, I think I'm going to make it full screen now. Yeah, I hope the screen is visible now.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Now we can
it's
see.
visible.
Yeah.
It's visible and you are audible.
Greetings from Jipmer Pondicherry. I think nice to join the Trauma 2020 virtual conference. And thanks for the organizing team, especially Professor Amit Gupta. As regards the topic of pediatric abdominal injury, what is different? What might mean is it may be dealing with what is different from the adult, as well as with regard to the pediatric injury itself, what is current as of now and what is different over the past few years. So this topic also will be touching upon some general aspects of pediatric injury, which is a little unavoidable. So I kindly request you to bear with me for that. Thank you. So this is the overview of the topic. Now, about 30% of visits of the children in the emergency department consists of trauma-related causes. If we take the blunt abdominal injury, that is the third most common cause of deaths in pediatric trauma. Especially if it is an unrecognized fatal injury, pediatric abdominal trauma is the most common cause. Now, as regards the serious abdominal injuries have non-specific or subtle external signs is very relevant as far as pediatric abdominal trauma is concerned. This slide shows the kind of mortality, and if it is an isolated liver or spleen injury, the mortality which is less than about 20% can markedly rise to more than 50% as the number of injuries gets added and when the vessels also get.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Krishan Kumar. Your voice is not clear and clearly audible. Please.
Hello, is the voice?
Yes, now it is clear. Now it is clear.
Yeah, okay.
Now it is clear.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'll just keep up. Okay, with regard to the challenges as far as the child is concerned, it is not just the pediatric trauma score which is different in the child. The child as such is a misfit as far as the emergency room is concerned. So the main challenge being the communication issues, so which need to be looked into when a child comes into the emergency room. Now, as far as the mode of injury is concerned, self-fall is not one of the common causes. It is as one of the very important causes as far as pediatric abdominal trauma is concerned. Now, we had done a study earlier which was published, even that showed that about 27% of the abdominal traumas are related to self-fall as far as children are concerned. So the same thing is echoed in the Western literature as well. I just showed the one, this was published in 2016. This is the data from the American College of Surgery. Now, if we look at a child who has had a trauma, the kinetic energy which gets transmitted to a small abdominal surface results in multiple injuries because the space for dissipation is quite less. Now, also, the ribs which are not ossified are quite flexible and they do not offer a very good protection. The diaphragm is also quite flat, which pushes down all the organs into the abdomen, and moreover, in a child, the abdomen is like a tightly packed showcase, and exposing the liver, which is relatively large compared to the pediatric abdomen, is much injury prone.
Sir, sorry to interrupt. Your voice is still not clear.
Hello. Hello. Is the voice better, sir?
Yeah, it is clear now, but in between it's not clear.
Okay. Okay. Hello. I think the voice is clear now.
Yes, sir.
Can you please continue? Continue.
Yeah. Yeah, the physiology is also another different thing in a child as far as a child is concerned. The vitals are quite different. The heart rate, BPS, everything differs with the age. Now, very often when a child comes to the trauma because of swallowing affair or aerophagia, there is a lot of gastric dilatation, which needs to be kept in mind because over a period of time, what might happen is that this might lead to risk of aspiration and can, because of the sequence of events such as it keeps accumulating, can cause hypoventilation as well as hypovolemia. This needs to be kept in mind when we evaluate a child with abdominal trauma. Also, the presentation of shock in a child is very much different. It can be like a hypoventilation, skin mottling, and things like metabolic instability. Now, it's the thing to keep in mind that in a child, the physiological reserve is very good, so that almost 30 to 40% of blood loss is very much tolerated, and at some point of time, the child suddenly decompensates, maybe a point of no return. So again, this needs to be kept in mind when we are evaluating a child in the ER room for abdominal trauma. Also, associated conditions, for example, enlarged kidney because of pyelonephrosis, backbone bleeding disorders, all these things need to be kept in mind during the evaluation, which can color the picture differently. Shock index, which is adjusted for the pediatric age, is another thing which can be quite useful because it can predict the need for intervention. And what we know from the literature is that almost more than 90% of the time it is accurate, especially for grade 3 and brain injury. But these are the various signs which we need to look for when we are examining a child, which can indicate that there is an abdominal injury. Looking at this slide, it is easy to understand the various skin changes which are obvious, especially the one on the top, which we refer to as androgen skin pattern because of the androgen which hits the child. So this is very much linked to a pancreatic trauma or injury. As far as imaging is concerned, what we understand is that we need to take the imaging a little gentler as far as the child is concerned. As far as radiation exposure is concerned, what is important is that one fatal malignancy can occur for every 1,000 people cancer in any child. So we call this as alarm cases, which means as low as reasonably achievable. So which make that CT scans when we order in a child, we really order with great carefully with in mind. Also, accurate, we have got this contrast enhanced ultrasound which is coming up in a big way, but although it is not being recommended at the gold standard, results have been shown that as good or equal to the CT scan. These are the indications for performing a PT in an otherwise stable child. Abdominal pain, tenderness, sensation, the skin changes that we saw before, presence of gross hematuria in liver enzymes which are elevated more than 3 times, and also the pancreatic enzyme. Now, this is one slide which can tell that if all these 7 signs, when they are absent, can indicate that a CT scan can be safely withheld, which means we are talking about a child who is otherwise stable, and all these 7 are not present, we can safely exclude that there are abdominal trauma as well as recommendation. Thank you.